Hello, and thanks for joining me for this webinar around the whole grain story, why grains are so much more than just fibre. I'm Felicity Curtin, an accredited practicing dietitian and the nutrition manager with the Grains and Legumes Nutrition Council. The aim of this webinar is to share an overview of grains, and especially whole grains. It will sharpen your knowledge in the what, the why, and the how. What exactly is a whole grain, why we should eat them, as well as what you can do with that knowledge. You may work in product development or regulations, or you might be a dietitian working with clients or as a consultant to the food industry. The information I'll cover today will arm you with the knowledge to make recommendations to friends, patients and colleagues about choosing healthier whole grain foods, reformulating current products, and making accurate whole grain claims on pack. So first, a bit of background about GLNC. We're a not-for-profit health promotion charity and the independent authority on the nutrition and health benefits of grains and legumes. We work across the entire value chain, from growers, millers, with universities and public health and research organisations, with manufacturers and retailers, and also government, all ultimately with the intention of encouraging Australians to eat more of these foods as part of a healthy diet. And the way that we do this is by working with a range of industry contributors who all represent grain and legume foods and who we work really closely with to amplify our message around these foods. As a brief overview of the webinar, first I'll start by giving a bit of an evidence update on grains and with particular focus on whole grains. And then I'll touch on current levels of consumption in Australia by sharing results from GLNC's consumption study. Next, I'll explain the current level of regulation around on-pack whole grain claims in Australia and the role that GLNC plays in this. Then finally, I'll share how you can put this knowledge into action by giving you a step-by-step guide to understanding how to choose whole grain products and also how to calculate whole grain in grams by looking at the ingredients list. We all know that grains and grain foods like bread, rice, pasta and noodles are healthy and an important part of a balanced diet. And this is backed up by the fact that grains have made up one of the 5 core food groups and have been a major part of the Australian dietary guidelines ever since they were first created in the 1970s. So the next few slides are going to share a little bit more about grains and the evidence behind them to give us a real understanding of why we recommend these foods for good health. But before I get into that, I'm going to first start with a little bit of a quiz to test your knowledge. And this question comes from the 2011 National Nutrition Survey. So it says, in Australia, grains are the leading source of A, fibre, B, carbohydrates, C, folate, D, iron, E, iodine, F, thiamine, or G, magnesium. So in Australia, grains are the leading source of, in fact it's H, grains are the leading source of all of these nutrients. So not only fibre, which generally I find is what people think to be the answer to this question, but grains are the leading source of these 7 key nutrients that often fall short in Australians' diets. So I think what this illustrates is that although we do generally give grains credit for fibre, often they get overlooked and don't get credit for all of the other nutrients that they naturally provide. So grains are nutritious and we should include them every day. And today I'm going to focus on that fact that grains and whole grains are more than just being high in fibre. But it is true that not all grains are equal, and it really is the whole grains that have the major health benefits. So whole grains and whole grain foods are those that still have each of those 3 layers intact. The whole grain foods like whole grain bread, pasta and brown rice have still got that bran, endosperm and germ layer. And you can imagine that once that bran layer is removed to create refined grains and flour and then used to make refined grain foods like white bread, pasta and rice, there's significantly reduced nutrients with less fibre, vitamins, minerals and phytonutrients. And there's good evidence to show that people who eat more whole grains are less likely to gain weight, suffer from a range of chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and even some cancers like bowel. So the definition for what a whole grain is just here on the screen. And it is just like that image from the slide before, the whole grain with each of those 3 layers intact. But it also includes whole grains that have been broken down by processes like being ground, milled, cracked, or flaked. And so long as these are put back together when they're used to form products like breads and cereals, so long as they're put back together in the proportions that represent what it was in that original whole grain, these can still be considered whole grain products. And the kinds of whole grains that you might see that are making up general foods on the supermarket are things like wholeless barley, but not pearl barley, which is refined, corn, including popcorn, millet, oats, rice, including brown, wild, red, and black, rye, sorghum, triticale, a whole range of different kinds of wheat, including those ancient varieties like freekeh and spelt, teff, fonio, sprouted whole grains, and those last 3, amaranth, buckwheat, and quinoa, which are a bit unique. Botanically, those are considered seeds, but given their nutritional value is similar to other grains and the way that we eat them is quite similar to other grains, they're actually called pseudo grains. So we do group them in with all of these others here. So going back to the research, as I've said, it is very clear that whole grains are protective for our health. And to show that a little bit more, I'm going to run through this 2016 Lancet study. Now, this was a risk assessment of environmental, behavioural and metabolic risks contributing to the global burden of disease. And it gives a nice snapshot of how these risks have changed between 1990, 2005 and then 2015. What you can see that I've highlighted here is that low whole grain intake has not only moved up on the list in this time, going from number 15 in 1990 up to number 13 in 2015 in terms of how much it's contributing to global burden of disease. But low intake of whole grain foods is also ahead of low fruit, nuts and seeds, vegetables, and omega-3 fatty acids from seafood. So low whole grains is a big problem globally for our health, and it's actually becoming a bigger problem. But I think that the positive spin on this is that it's a nice, easy swap that we can make in our diets and recommend others to make. Swapping from refined grains to whole grains has the potential to have really, really significant positive impacts on our health, and it doesn't need to change our behaviour significantly. So now we know why we should be eating grains, let's focus on how much we should be aiming for. Based on the Australian Dietary Guidelines, this varies for adults between sort of 4 to 6 serves, depending on age and gender. And there's this general recommendation of mostly whole grain foods. But at GLNC, we take it back a step and simplify that and suggest enjoying grains 3 to 4 times each day, with at least half of those whole grains to really get that benefit. And GLNC have also developed a daily target intake for whole grain, which is similar to what you might know as the recommended dietary intake, or the RDI, for other nutrients like fibre. So the DTI for whole grain is 48 grams a day for children and adults over 9 years, and 32 grams a day for children 2 to 8 years. And to put that 48 gram target into perspective, it's really as easy as choosing any 3 of these options, which all have at least 16 grams of whole grain per serve. And of course, there are many other options. So it doesn't necessarily look too difficult to achieve reaching that whole grain DTI. It could be as simple as 1/4 of a cup of whole grain cereal, 1 slice of whole grain bread, and 4 whole grain crackers. But how do you think most Australians stack up? Well, first, some really positive news. The 2017 consumption study that was funded by GLNC found that fewer Australians were actively limiting grain foods. So this is sitting at 47%, but that's down from 60% 3 years ago. However, looking a little bit more closely at the kinds of grain foods we're eating, it's clear that we're mainly choosing refined over those more nutritious whole grain varieties. You can see, looking at the quantities, there was an average of almost 6 serves of whole grain foods every day, which is just about at that the top end of the 4 to 6 serves the dietary guidelines recommend. But qualitatively, only just over 30% of these choices were whole grain, with an average of 26 grams of whole grain. And what that tells us is that we're eating less than half of the recommended amount of whole grain. So while it's really positive that people are eating these grains and giving themselves permission to eat grains again, the main health benefits really do come from those good quality whole grain versions. So now let's talk a little bit about the code of practice for whole grain content claims, which is an example of how GLNC works to make choosing whole grain products easier for consumers. Since the ZANS doesn't regulate claims around whole grain like they do with other nutrients, the code was developed to fill a gap. It's based on the dietary guidelines and GLNC's whole grain daily target intake, and it sets an industry standard for labelling of whole grain foods. Now, this aims to benefit public health and consumers by enabling them to make more informed food choices, but also manufacturers who gain a competitive edge by displaying those evidence-based claims on pack. And as part of the code, we outline 3 different levels of claim. So contains whole grain is 8 grams or more per serve, high in whole grain is 16 or more grams per serve, and very high in whole grain is 24 grams or more per serve. And the code also outlines suggested wording and synonyms for other ways that wording can be made on pack. And to give you a bit of an idea, it is really important to have guidance around whole grain claims because we know that there's such a wide range when it comes to the amount of whole grain within foods. So using these 2 breads as an example, which are both great products that are registered with the code and both do have whole grain in them, this one on the left has 10 grams of whole grain per serve, which comes into about 20% of the DTI. And this one on the right has 33 grams of whole grain, which is nearly 70% of the DTI. And even more broadly than that, from regular audits that GLNC carries out, we know that in breads, in whole grain breads, the amount of whole grain varies between as little as 2 grams per serve to more than 70 grams per serve. So there is massive variation, and having clear guidelines for claims means that we can make informed choices about the foods that we're buying and eating, and also that we can make informed recommendations to clients on what to look for and what to purchase. So to get a little bit of an understanding of how the code had been accepted since it was developed, in 2016, an impact assessment was carried out. At that time, there were 20 registered users, which now sits at 30, and there were 375 registered products, which is now almost 600 across both Australia and New Zealand. But even more exciting than that is the fact that in the space of those 3 years from the code's development to this first impact assessment, registered users launched more than 200 new whole grain products and also reformulated 43 existing products, showing that the market's changing and the code is encouraging manufacturers to respond to this greater focus on healthy whole grain foods. And to put that into perspective, that new product development and the reformulation equated to over 400 Olympic swimming pools worth of whole grain being added into the Australian food supply. And here's some examples of the code in action. So we've got on the left, very high in whole grain. In the middle here, 70% of your daily target for whole grains. And then on the right, this one's high in whole grain. And we've also seen from our regular product audits, really exciting progress on supermarket shelves. When we looked at bread in 2017, we noted a 10% reduction in white bread on shelf compared to the previous audit 2 years earlier. So that meant 20 whole loaves replaced by wholemeal or whole grain. And aside from that, there was also definite innovation and new product development with new ingredients used, particularly legumes, and a whole range of products to appeal to many, many consumers. There's also definitely more convenience products. This comes from our grain foods audit earlier in 2018, in which we found double the number of microwavable grains since 2016. So things like microwavable brown rice and mixes like brown rice and quinoa, which makes makes the process much quicker for consumers who we know are concerned by that time barrier and the extra time it might take to cook whole grains. Further to that, we saw more options available on shelf, so 4 times the amount of other grains in 2 years. Other grains meaning things like quinoa, amaranth, buckwheat and teff. So there's more on offer for consumers, and it's easier than ever to make a healthy whole grain choice. So really good things are happening in Australia in supermarkets, but the question is, how can we continue to work together to encourage Australians to eat more of these healthy whole grain foods and improve health? Well, to boost your confidence in understanding whole grain, I'm now going to run through 3 steps. First one is knowing how to recognise whole grain, knowing exactly what to look for on pack, and then finally, knowing how to read ingredients lists so that you'll be able to calculate the amount of whole grain in grams per serve. So the first step is to know your whole grains. Going back to that definition from earlier in the webinar, a whole grain needs to contain all of its original 3 layers. So some options, some whole grains are really easy to spot. Like these ones up on the screen here, things like buckwheat, brown rice, freekeh, even popcorn are still in their whole grain form. And others like whole grain pasta have only been mixed with 1 or 2 other ingredients. So it's fairly obvious to the eye to know that these are whole grain. Where it becomes tricky is when these are broken down and then put back together with other ingredients. So the next thing we'll talk about is what to look for on pack. Now, determining whole grain and understanding whole grain claims on pack is easy if a product is registered with GLNC's Code of Practice. So you can see this and you can check this very quickly by checking out our website and having a look at the current registered users that are using our Code of Practice. And since we've launched this new searchable database for our whole grain registered products, there's even more reason for manufacturers to register products with the code because it's easy for consumers to search and compare whole grain products by food category, brand, and level of whole grain. But when it comes to deciphering those whole grain claims, it's important to know what can be said. The code outlines the different ways that manufacturers can talk about whole grain on pack. So this can include content claims, which might be contains whole grain, high in whole grain, very high in whole grain. Plus, there are a range of synonyms that can be used in place of these, like rich in whole grain or excellent source of whole grain. You might also see factual statements. So on a bag of oats or brown rice, you might see 100% whole grain or a certain percentage of whole grain. Or you could also see a daily target intake statement, which might be 1 serve provides 20% of the DTI for whole grain. Having a general understanding of the different ways that whole grain is talked about makes it much easier to get an understanding of different whole grain foods. And all of this is explained in detail within the Code of Practice that's available on GLNC's website. And here's a few more examples of the code in action. So you can see here we've got this muesli is an excellent source of whole grain. Again, this bread that has 70% of the DTI. These tortillas are high in whole grain. These muesli bars are also high in whole grain. And finally, these crisp breads have 40% of the DTI. But unfortunately, not all manufacturers are registered with the code and not all products are making whole grain claims. So it's not always immediately easy to understand the level of whole grain by just looking on pack. To put that into perspective, the results from our recent grains audit, where we looked at things like rice, pasta, noodles and other grains, we found that although 1 in 5 or around 20% of all grain products were eligible to be making a whole grain claim, only 8% of these were registered with our Code of Practice. So what that means is that there's a huge opportunity to work with the food industry to encourage more on-pack communication around whole grain. Now the third step is around knowing how to calculate whole grain. This is the really important part. And it's a useful skill if you're a health professional working with clients, being able to gauge the amount that they're currently eating and encouraging them to up their whole grain intake. but also for those who are currently consulting to or working in the food industry, because knowing this enables you to know what claims can be made or how you might go about reformulating foods to boost the amount of whole grain and then make a whole grain claim. So for products to be able to be eligible to make a whole grain claim, according to the code, they must have at least 8 grams of whole grain per serve. And from there are these 3 levels. 8 grams or more per serve contains whole grain, 16 grams or more is high in whole grain, and 24 grams or more is very high in whole grain. But when we talk about whole grain in grams, how do we actually calculate it? It's not something that you see on a nutrition information panel like you would with carbohydrates or fibre. So let's run through a crash course in calculating whole grain from the ingredients list. Now, the most important thing to know with calculating whole grain is that it starts with percentage labelling. So the really important thing that is needed to be able to make this, to be able to do this calculation is that the percentage of whole grain ingredients is needed on the ingredients list. From there, the general formula is grams of whole grain per serve equals the percentage of whole grain ingredients in the finished food or the total product, divided by 100, multiplied by a manufacturer serve size. So let's look at these mini wraps as an example, these whole wheat wraps. So let's just blow up that ingredients list, and I've bolded here the whole grain ingredients. So we've got whole wheat flour. Now, to my eye, that is the only whole grain ingredient there. So if we then look at the calculation, we've got 64% divided by 100 multiplied by serve size, which is 48 grams. That comes in at just under 31 grams of whole grain per serve. So have a think back to those 3 levels of whole grain. And what we can see is that with just under 31 grams of whole grain per serve, that qualifies this product to make a very high in whole grain claim, which is the highest level of claim. And in fact, it contributes nearly 65% towards that 48 grams daily target intake, which again illustrates just how easy it is to meet that target by eating whole grain foods. Let's go straight into another example. So this ingredients list has got quite a few different whole grain ingredients there. Now you'll see that I've got the percentage for some of those, but a couple of those, so organic oat flour and organic puffed millet, unfortunately don't include the percentage in the ingredients list there. For the purpose of our calculations here, what that means is that we simply can't include them. So I'll put forward that calculation with just the information we have there. So those ingredients add up to 42.7% whole grain, divided by 100, multiplied by a serve size, which is 44 grams. That comes in at 18.7 grams of whole grain per serve. Again, thinking back to those 3 levels of claim, which was 8, 16 and 24. This one qualifies for a high in whole grain claim, and it contributes 39% towards that 48 gram DTI. Let's go straight into one more. So this is super seed and grain crackers, and the ingredients in the ingredients list, we've got 30% grains, and by having a look at those ingredients, quinoa and brown rice, we can be confident that those are whole grain, since we know that they are in their whole grain state with each of the 3 layers intact. So we can go straight into the calculation, 30% divided by 100 multiplied by 20 grams, which is the serve size, and that comes in at 6 grams of whole grain per serve. So unfortunately what that means is that this product is not eligible to make a whole grain claim. And while it is a great food product that is, it does contain whole grain, unfortunately the serve size is just a little bit too small for it to then qualify for a whole grain claim. Now I keep mentioning that percentage labelling, and it is really important because what you can see here is that this spread here doesn't state the percentage of wholemeal flour. And that's unfortunate because it's highly likely this would be eligible to make a claim. But of course, this information is generally easily found by someone within the technical team. So in this case, although we can't make an assumption now about the amount of whole grain in grams. This is information that's easily found, so I'd encourage you to contact the manufacturer for more information. So let's just run through two more examples here. We've got these muesli bars and this popcorn. So in the ingredients here for the muesli bars, we've got 22% barley max, whole grain rolled barley flakes, and then we've got 15% whole grain rolled oats. To me, that looks like the only whole grain ingredients, and the serve size is 35 grams. So that one comes out to 12.9 grams of whole grain per serve. And remembering those three levels of claims, 8, 16 and 24, what that means is that qualifies for a contains whole grain or source of whole grain claim. Similarly, the popcorn, we've got 63% popcorn. Knowing that corn, and that includes popcorn, is a whole grain, that means that this comes out to close to the bars, 12.6 grams of whole grain per serve. And again, that one qualifies for a source of whole grain serve. So to sum up, whole grains are really key. They're important for good health, but unfortunately few of us are getting enough of them. Labelling around whole grain claims is not mandatory. There is no, our code of practice is voluntary. So what that means is that understanding and deciphering whole grain claims can be confusing. So let's work together to get the word out there about whole grains. And the way that we can do this is, first of all, by making the swap yourself. So making the swap from refined grains to whole grains, which will really benefit your health. Also, let's be specific about the benefits of whole grains. We know they're high in fibre, but they're also rich in a variety of other nutrients like vitamins, minerals, and even phytonutrients. And also, let's work with the food industry to improve the products that are currently on shelf, and also to make on-pack claims that really showcase whole grain foods and encourage people to choose more of these. So thank you for watching this webinar, and definitely check out GLNC's website to find out more about the code of practice and products that are registered with the code, and feel free to get in touch with us via email for more information.